and welcome back to the Book Festival. And now we are joined by the wonderful Mark Grenside, who's going to be giving us a bit of insight into his novel, Fallout. So, Mark, it's very exciting to be here with you.
Thank you for asking me.
It's an honor to be sharing the stage with you and to be having a good chat about your book. Now, talk to us a little bit about how art imitates life in this book, because it does, doesn't it? There's so much crossover between your fascinating life going into this brilliant thriller.
Well, that's kind of you. Art does imitate life, or the best thrillers, and you need to have a feeling of that it's real when you're reading it. To me, a great thriller shouldn't be so much fiction as this could happen, whether it's North by Northwest or even Usual Suspects. There's got to be a ring of truth to it. This one was based on a number of things. I mean, as a youth, I was the water skiing instructor at the Eden Rock Hotel in the south of France, which takes place in the book. I then, after I did that, I went off and did some kidnap and ransom insurance in Lloyd's. And then I went, as we're going to get onto, I went to work for the Muppets, so I lived in Los Angeles for a while, even though they were based in London, and that also is in the book. And then I thought it was time to write a thriller that had movies as a background, with someone who actually knows something about it, without being too rude. But a lot of people write about movies and have never been involved in them.
Absolutely. But let's stay with your career for a moment, because to say you've had a varied career would be a gross understatement, wouldn't it? So I'd love to just give our viewers a taste of the many things you've done, which of course all is underpinned in Fallout.
Well, yeah, I'm probably verging on ADD, because I find it very difficult to do something for much longer than 5 or 6 years. As I said, I was a water skiing bum for a while, but my first real job was I worked in Lloyd's Insurance in London, and I did kidnap and ransom insurance. People may not understand that you can actually insure against being kidnapped and ransomed. So I did that for about 5 years, and then through a strange quirk of fate, I ended up having lunch in New York with Jim Henson. I was offered a job in their new distribution company, which was called Henson International Television. And I joined them, and I worked for the Muppets for about 5 years. I was involved in raising money for TV shows like Fraggle Rock and Muppet Babies, movies like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. And in that business, if you can raise money, it's another entry into producing. So after I stopped doing that, I went into producing. I produced a lot of TV series, miniseries, and movies. And then I ended up owning a channel. I bought the Hallmark channel, which was played here for a while, which we eventually sold to NBC. During that ride, I also had a music business. I then went back into producing again for American networks. And then I left the UK, moved here, and wrote a book. So, and I don't know what's coming next, but yeah, I like to have a varied career. I think it keeps you relatively young and learning, though I hated it at school. I think as I got older, I appreciated it more.
Well, I love how every time we chat, there's a part of your story that I haven't heard yet. Now, I know, again, from chatting to you many times over, there are some very well-known names that have featured in your story so far. Some that our viewers would know quite well. What stories can you share about them?
Well, I have to be very careful I don't get sued. So, but a couple of people who know with us know more. Michael Jackson, we did a show with him, a Muppet special, which rather sweetly, he refused to talk to Jim Henson, who was directing it. He would only talk to Jim Henson when he put a frog on his hand, and then he would take direction from Kermit. There was an episode that a couple of people may know about this now, but when I was a young guy working for Jim Henson, our original office was in London, and I came in one day and we were shooting Dark Crystal, and there was a guy in my desk, on my seat in my desk with his feet on my desk, to which I rather rudely asked him to move, thinking he was Jim Henson's driver. Jim was upstairs washing his teeth. He came down and said, I'm not going to the studio today. So I turned to this guy and said, well, you can go home now. And Jim Henson looked at him and said, Stephen, Mark Grenside, this is Steven Spielberg. And he never said anything. He could have been very rude about it. And about 4 months later, I was in the Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles, standing in the queue to get my car. And I heard this shh behind me, you know. And obviously somebody famous was coming out of the Polo Lounge, and it was Stephen. And he came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, I'm sorry I haven't got my chauffeur's hat on, but can I give you a lift? Which was very sweet of him, because everybody was incredibly polite to me at that hotel for the next couple of weeks. But yeah, you meet a lot of people, you meet a lot of idols. Some have their, you know, feet of clay, some don't. Some are difficult. Robert Duvall knocked out the director on the last take of Lonesome Dove. When the director said, cut, that's the end, and he just walked over and decked him. So there you go.
Oh, there you go. And lots of international stories as well. Obviously, you've hopped about quite a bit. Cuba, the US, even Moscow. What's that been like? How have you bridged all that together? And then, of course, you end up here.
Yeah, I was very lucky. I think at last count, I've done 120 countries, during which time, you know, you have interesting airplane trips. I sat next to Mike Tyson once on a plane, which was very difficult to talk to him because I had to keep my seat vertical because he's so wide that when he leaned back, his face was still where my head was. I remember checking into an airport once in Los Angeles to fly to New York, and the lady at the check-in desk said, we just want to check you don't mind that Hilary Swank has bought the seat next to you. And I'm going, do I mind? So as soon as I checked in, I rang all my friends and I said, I'm sitting next to Hilary Swank. I get on the plane and there is a parrot in a cage. And apparently she bought the seat next to me for her parrot because she was flying on the MGM jet to New York and they wouldn't let her bring the parrot. So I had a squawking parrot all the way to New York.
Bit disappointing for you?
Very disappointing, very disappointing. I can't wait to meet her and I'm going to tell her what I think about her parrot. Anyway.
I would like to see that if we can arrange to film it. That would be a lot of fun. And now you have chosen Malta as your home.
I have.
And of course we are here for the Malta Book Festival. So tell us, what brought you to the island?
Well, I think, again, without sort of sounding silly, I got to a stage, I produced quite a lot of television, mini-series and series, and I was getting a bit bored of it. And I realized that if I sort of kick back from that, I would just get old and crispy living in London. So I said to my long-suffering wife, it's time for a change. By happenstance, I'd set up a company here. And I thought, well, you know what? Let's go to Malta. It's as good as anywhere to try and go and see what life is like. But we had to do it properly. We sold everything in the UK, so we couldn't run back. Okay. I think sometimes you do have to burn bridges. We came here 5 years ago and we've never looked back. We've made great friends here. I have another business that is run out of London that I'm a founder of. It's a CBD business, and we're in Boots and Harrods and Tesco's, but I'm a founding partner of that, so I can speak to everybody on the phone on that quite easily. And we came here, I finished the book. I'm writing another book now that's set in Malta, and I love the place, and we've had great fun.
Well, I'm glad to hear. But you and I have spoken a little bit about the process of writing the book, and you know, you don't describe it necessarily as the easiest thing that you've done necessarily in your career, but take me back to the moment when you decided, right, I'm going to write a book.
Well, I think the thing is that television and movies is very collaborative, and unless you're a superstar, producer or director where everybody jumps to attention, you have to agree and compromise all the time. Mm-hmm. And although it's great fun, and I don't think there's anything beats walking onto a set of something that you had an idea about or a book that you bought a few months before, it was time to do something that I could be blamed for everything for. And a book, you know, it's yo-yo, you're on your own. So I think that was the first reason I wanted to justify that I could do something on my own. I had no idea how difficult it would turn out to be. I have huge respect. I publicly apologize to all the writers who work for me that I gave a bad time to, because it is very difficult. I find it difficult, but I love editing. Maybe I should have been an editor. I find the writing process quite difficult, and I have to force myself to get to the end of something. And then I go back and I start editing it, and I go, it's not as bad as I thought it was, or that was quite funny, or this isn't funny. So it's a very difficult experience, because for me, I'm like the reader. I have no idea really where the story is going. Yes, I had a rough idea of what the MacGuffin was and who the characters were going to be, but I had no idea when I started it how the book would end. And I tried to do it the other way around. I tried to write with a story outline for a chapter, and it never worked. I had to do it myself. And I kept on thinking, what would be funny or surprising or different? What's the least expected thing that you would think is going to happen in this chapter? And that's how I predicated what I was doing.
Well, it's been very well received, hasn't it? It's got lots and lots of 5-star reviews.
Yeah.
You know, it's endorsed by some really amazing people. Let's talk through for our viewers who might be thinking, oh, I might get a copy of that.
Please, I've got to feed the dogs.
Now, it is a thriller.
Yep.
Okay, so how would you describe Fallout in your own words? What's the story?
Well, it's really a two-tiered story in that, and I'm not comparing like for like, but in the same way that Grisham uses the law as his backdrop, and the late Dick Francis, for example, always used horse racing as a backdrop. Although it's described as a thriller in the entertainment industry, yes, it is. The backdrop is the film industry, and the backstory is a writer completes a screenplay that he sends to 5 very particular people, all of whom were part of a movie that stopped shooting about 25 years before. And they slowly start to understand that in this story is the clues as to what happened 25 years ago. So that's the backstory. The actual MacGuffin as to what actually went on has nothing to do with the film industry. It's a historical fact. A lot of people don't know about it, so I'm not going to go into it. But what I tried to do is to write a story that is sprinkled with the names of real people, so that when you're reading it, it's not quite like, let's say, Sunset Boulevard, where you had to guess who some of the people were. I luckily was able to name certain people in the book. So when you're reading it, there's a very thin line between what's real and what's fiction. As somebody once said, you know, that you should write what you know, and I would only add to you should write what you know, and what you don't know, you better be a bloody good liar doing it. Because as long as you can scene those two together, I think that makes an interesting book. A bit like Day of the Jackal.
And did you enjoy it?
That's difficult. As I said, I found the writing process quite hard, but the sense of satisfaction, even when you got to the end of a paragraph, let alone a chapter, was amazing. And, you know, it took some time, but, you know, it was...
How long did it take?
Oh, off and on several years, really. The next one's got to be much faster than that. But I was busy and I was preoccupied and I had other things going on. But it's a franchise. There are 2 characters, a man and a woman, who sort out the clues and work out what actually happened in this book. And they will come back into the next book. So it's a franchise of thrillers, I hope, set in the entertainment industry. And I hope people who read it, you know, they go, oh, I never understood that, or oh, I never knew that, or that's really interesting. Because I think, you know, we are obsessed with media in this world, and very few times do people lift the kimono and tell you really what's going on. And if you do it, hopefully in a humorous way, people will enjoy it.
Definitely. So you've created some really wonderful characters in the book, including a very strong female lead.
Yeah.
What was it like creating these characters? How did you, as you progressed through the story, make sure that they were staying true to themselves? How did they become really real for you?
Yeah, well, again, I had to be very careful I wasn't going to be sued by someone. But, yeah, some of the characters, there's an agent in there. Well, I've dealt with agents forever and a day. The male lead character is a producer. Well, not too far from the truth for me. The female character you mentioned is one of those characters that you go, I never knew that sort of person existed. She actually bills all the stands in Cannes for the film festival. She's actually based on somebody I knew, although she is half Chinese in the story. The woman I based it on was very English. They're very successful people, but they're very empty because the stuff they create only lasts 3 or 4 days. They build these wonderful stands or they organize these fantastic parties. So yeah, she was based on reality. The director, yeah, he was based on actually a friend of mine. The writer, Australian writer, they're all based on real people up to a degree. But what you have to get right is the environment, and luckily, as you kindly said, a lot of people who wrote reviews on the books are Oscar-nominated directors, producers, Emmy Award-winning television producers. So to get an endorsement from them, they're saying, look, this is real, he's right, it's funny, and obviously it's fiction, but the background is correct.
Have you had anybody read the book yet and think that they recognize themselves in the story?
God, I hope not. No, I don't think so. I think that's too dangerous. No, I mean, it's been optioned to hopefully be made as a series for American television by a very well-known producer who won't see himself in there. But yeah, I think it's one of those books, hopefully, if the people within the industry read it and go, I know exactly who that person is, but actually they don't. But they're realistic enough for them to understand.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, like you said, the book's been optioned. It's just been read as well. It's now a sort of audio book as well. So how does that feel to see something that you one day just dreamt up as an idea suddenly come to life in all these different forms? Again, I know we'll have lots of people watching today who are perhaps aspiring authors themselves, or maybe they've written a book, but perhaps it's not been optioned yet, or isn't an audiobook. What does that feel like to have it come to life so vibrantly?
Well, I mean, obviously it's very satisfying because a lot of work went into it. It's nice to be justified that some people have bought it and read it and everything else. That's great. I mean, for people who are aspiring to write, it's a cliche, but don't give up. You have to stick. You have to stick to it. And there are certain disciplines that I brought, for example, from the film world that I brought to the book. In a film, you always try and get into a scene as late as possible. You always enter a conversation usually halfway through. That's not always true of books, but it's the way I wrote this book. Again, because I came from film, it's quite descriptive. It sets scenes, I hope, quickly, and you get a visual idea of where it's being set. So it reads very much like a film, if you see what I mean. But that's the background I came from. There are plenty of writers who don't write like that, and a lot of them are coloured by their background. But yeah, for anybody out there who's thinking of writing a book or wants to write a book, first of all, it's a huge achievement to get to the end, right? Even if you're the only person who's read it. But yeah, you have to keep at it.
Yeah. Did you always know it was going to be a thriller? Was that always going to be the genre for you?
Oh yeah. I first of all, most of the stuff that I made was drama. It was all drama. So thrillers were always part of my creative background. And yeah, I mean, the very first thing I decided to do was to try and create a franchise within the film industry that was real and was amusing. Also, I think that I was very lucky / unlucky in that I wrote it in a quite light style. In fact, one of the writers who's looking at it was the writer of the Thomas Crown Affair, the second version with Piers Brosnan. And that's the kind of temperature that I was looking at. And until coronavirus hit, most thrillers had ever since the movie Seven with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman had been very dark. You had very flawed villains, or heroes, sorry, and very dark stories. A lot of them were child murderers, mass murderers, drug murdering and everything else. And the sort of Lethal Weapon type thriller, although this isn't quite that genre, had all fallen by the wayside. But one of the results of coronavirus is people now seem not to want dark thrillers anymore. They want a little bit of lightness of touch. And funnily enough, you know, Mel and what's his name from Lethal Weapon have agreed to shoot another movie. They're just about to start it, which would never have happened recently. It's literally only in the last 6 months.
Yeah, people looking for a bit of lightness, a bit of fun. And of course, this does that, doesn't it? Because there's so many funny moments in the book as well. But again, staying on the topic of it being a thriller, when you are writing a thriller, is there anything that's different, perhaps, about what you have to think? I mean, obviously, there's got to be twists and turns, as many as possible, as dramatic as possible. Does that add pressure, do you think?
I wouldn't say pressure, but it informs how I write. As I said, you know, to each his own. But you can't do it relentlessly. But you have to keep thinking to yourself, you know, what would most shock or surprise somebody in the scene? Now, you can't do it all the time, obviously. You know, if you look at a director like Hitchcock or something, you would have quite normal scenes, and then suddenly, bang, he'd hit you with a surprise. That's what informs me here. I try and always keep the reader on his toes. Obviously, you like to end a chapter on a high point, but I think you also, there's a very famous scriptwriter in America who said character is action, and he's right. So the surprise doesn't have to be, you know, some clue in a teapot. It can be character. And if the character does something what you think is out of character, that is action. There's a great example in Chinatown, I don't know if you all saw it, where Jack Nicholson is sitting in the car and Faye Dunaway is explaining she's having an affair with her father. Now, there was nothing in the script for Nicholson to do, but actually he took out a cigarette and then he got a lighter with no fuel in it on purpose, and he just kept flicking the lighter because he didn't want to hear what Faye Dunaway was saying. And that character was action. It was all about his frustration. And that's what you have to think about. Sorry, I'm talking an awful lot, but...
Well, I mean, it's all about your book, Mark. So, I mean... And again, I love hearing so many of your stories from Hollywood. Hollywood obviously plays a big role in this book. You know, if you look back on your time in Hollywood and obviously what you've put into the book, what would surprise our viewers about Hollywood that maybe just pops into your head at this point?
Well, I think there are two things. I think you have to understand it is a one-industry town on the whole. It's very difficult to go out and not talk about movies and television. In fact, I shared a house with a very well-known Australian writer who used to write the TV series Jag. And for fun, we used to take a dictionary and flip through it and stick a pin down, and then we had to use that word in the conversation and see how fast that word was attached to a movie. And it's surprising how quickly it happened. Yeah, it doesn't matter if it was umbrella, sweets, this, that, and the other. Some would always say, oh, you remember that it was, it was not M&M's in E.T., it was Reese's Pieces or whatever. You just can't get away from that. The other thing is it's a real dichotomy between incredibly shallow and then some really, really committed people. But, you know, some people take themselves very seriously, some not. I remember I was having lunch in a very well-established restaurant in Los Angeles called Chasen's, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. But Elizabeth Taylor asked them to send her chili out to Rome when she was filming Cleopatra. It's that kind of place.
Wow.
And I came in with an old-time producer called Tom McDermott, who was very, very famous. He used to, years ago, work with Steve McQueen and Ronald Reagan and God knows what. And we go in for lunch, and the waiter comes out, and there's a private dining room in Chasen's, and he came up to Tom and said, Mr. McDermott, Frank Sinatra's having a birthday, and he saw you come in, and he'd like for you and your guest to come for a drink. So I'm like, go see Frank Sinatra, come on. And so Tom sits me down, and he looks like somebody's inserted a space hopper into him. He says, now kid, the only thing about Frank is you just gotta be cool. So I go, okay, fine, you know. And sure enough, we finish our meal, the waiter comes out and says, Mr. Sinatra, we'd love you to come in. So I go into this dining room, and there's this huge long table, and I'm sure it's full of unbelievably well-known people, but the only person I recognized was Sammy Davis Jr. was still alive. Obviously, they were all still alive. And Tom McDermott goes, Frank, this is Mark, great producer from London, blah, blah, blah. And Mr. Sinatra goes, how'd you do? And I go, happy birthday. And he turns around and he starts to introduce me to everybody on the table. And right at the end of the table, there's this little guy with pebble glasses, and he looks like Mr. Magoo. Now, Mr. Magoo was based on Swifty Lazar. He was a very well-known agent who's long dead. So I'm going down the table, I'm going, who is this guy? And we get to the end, and Frank Sinatra goes, and this is Max Factor. And I go, Max Factor? There's a Max Factor? And Frank Sinatra turns around to my friend and goes, who is this limey? He doesn't give a shit about Frank Sinatra. All he cares about is Max Factor. So
do you think you made a good impression on Frank Sinatra? Did you get invited back?
I didn't get invited back, but I'm sure he still says to people, you know, I had this limey came in here. So I don't know, hopefully.
And when you're going through the book and you're creating it, and obviously, you know, your process is quite organic, right?
Yeah,
You've said you're not sitting down with a really clear plan.
No.
You're kind of just letting it happen.
Yeah.
You know, were these memories all coming back to you? Was it exciting to have the opportunity to sort of filter them or sort of, you know, drip them into the book? Or is that a beautiful part of the process?
Yeah. I think if nothing else, what writing does is it awakens memories. And things from the past come out. And the other thing is, for me, the subconscious is an amazing thing. I wrote little details about something that I had no idea why I wrote them, and yet as I came towards the denouement, I realized that there was a hook actually in that little detail that my subconscious said, just wait, you'll need it. And as I got to the end, I did use them. So yeah, that was interesting. And yeah, as they say, you've got to write what you know. Absolutely.
And so what would you say is your favorite part of the book? Now that you look at it and it's a complete thing, you know, are there scenes in it that really, really, you know, set you alight? Are you excited about seeing them on screen, hopefully, in the future?
Yes, there are. They fall into a number of categories. I mean, there's a particularly good fight scene set in a Swiss chalet. It's just a very unusual setting, and the setup is a huge surprise. You don't expect it to happen, and it's just a very different fight sequence with our hero not actually wanting to get drawn into this fight. He's a bit of a coward, and the woman manning him up to do it, or setting him up so he has to fight. So that was quite interesting. I love the burgeoning relationship between the male hero and the woman. They meet in Cannes at the film festival. They get drawn together because of the screenplay that the producer has sent, and this woman's paralyzed father was sent. And I love the way they make each other better people, which sounds very corny, but that is the basis of any good relationship story. You have to start with two people, and they just make each other better. So their dialogue fizzes when they're talking together, and I enjoy that. And then last of all, I'm not going to say, I love the reveal, and I don't think anybody sees that coming.
Yeah.
So those are favourite bits. But yeah, the two characters, I'm very, very fond of them. And
in fact, you are bringing them back.
I am bringing them back,
You are bringing
indeed.
them back. So let's talk a little bit now. You've said that you are working on the second book.
I am.
How does that feel at the moment? You know, you've got to go through it all over again, but the idea is there and you've started. Am I right?
Well, it's worse than that. I put 3 chapters of it in
course.
this book saying coming soon. So I have been a little remiss at working on it. I mean, I've done 150 pages. I know what the MacGuffin is. So the MacGuffin being the sort of the trick in the plot.
Do you know the end of this one?
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I know how it sets up roughly, only very roughly. Yeah, the same 2 characters, as in the first book is set in Los Angeles, London, Cannes, Switzerland, and the Philippines. This one is set in the Aleutian Islands, which are off the coast of Canada, Los Angeles again, France, and it ends in Malta. So the denouement is in Malta. And I've been picking some people's brains about some of the history, some of the buildings. It's called the Bastion, and it's not the Bastion, you all know, but it is set in Valletta. The Bastion is in Valletta.
Okay, so we should expect to see a bit of the island that we love appearing in this book.
Yeah, you will. You know, I might throw in some people I know.
Okay.
Be careful, you could be in there.
I could be in there. This is a very exciting, this will be the pinnacle of my life to make it into your next book.
Yes, well, we used to do that quite a lot. I have to say, as a producer, occasionally I would be very naughty and use people's names that either pleased me or irritated me. I know that in the Muppets, although he was a lovely guy, John Rizzo was the accountant, and he became Rizzo the rat. But
wow. Do you think he knew?
Oh, I'm sure he knew. I'm sure he charged extra.
So sort of staying with the next book and the idea for it, you know, what stage are you at? You've told us a little bit, you're 150 pages in.
Yeah.
You know, how are you going to prepare yourself now, knowing, have you given yourself a deadline?
Yes, I've got to do it by spring, probably next year. So I've really got to get on with it. 2021, yeah.
Wow, you've got to crack on.
So I've got to crack on a bit.
Because how long does it take?
Oh, it can be, well, you know, if you're a seasoned thriller writer, you know, it's usually only 3 months, but the research can be a long, long time. This one, a lot of the research I already know, but I'm in awe of people who can just churn out a book every year, just cracking on for 3 months. And there's, you know, again, I'm not comparing, but I mean, there's a very different group of writers. You have somebody like Forsyth, who, in a literary sense, is an incredibly good writer. And he only writes, I think he's written a dozen books, I think, max. And some of those are short stories. Or you have somebody like Patterson, although I don't think he writes them anymore. I think he gets other people to write them for him. But I mean, he can churn these out 2 a year. And I'm just in awe of that. In fact, there's a very well-known English writer, Anthony Horowitz, who is a very successful writer and screenwriter. I was at school with him, and his first job was William Tell. He was working in an advertising agency. And that was a series that I did, and that got him on the road to writing. And he bangs out 2 books a year.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I'd never be able to do that.
So you're going to lock yourself in your office? What's the plan?
Yes. Yeah, I'll end up with the tidiest office you've ever seen. My nails will be manicured. My shoes will be polished. All the books will be in the bookshelf, all neatly, alphabetically, and by height, and then I'll have to get down to writing. Yeah, I actually, once I get into it, I don't find it so hard. It's just, you know, it's like standing on the edge of a diving board. You know, once you jump,
Yeah.
full of hope, blind as a bat, then you're okay. But it's just sitting on the edge of the diving board. But I have to do it. My publisher wants it, so.
Well, there you go. It's happening.
It's happening.
Okay, well, before we start to wrap up, just tell our viewers one last time, why should they be reading Fallout?
Well, apart from the fact I need the royalties to feed the dogs.
Apart from the fact that we have to feed the dogs.
I think you should read it because it's a different kind of thriller. As I said, it's different because it's not dark, it's not a mass murderer, it's not a child murderer and everything else, but it's different. I like to think I write in a quite short, sharp style that's easy to read. It's very visual, but it opens the world that we all think we know really well, and it explains in an easygoing way, you know, how films get financed, what actually happens at the Cannes Film Festival, although in my case there's a murder. You know, the relationship between stars and producers and directors, even the difference between an executive producer, associate producer, a co-producer that comes out over a dinner. And also, it has a view on some parts of the world that people know well, like Los Angeles, and some part of the world that they don't know at all, like the Philippines. And there's some cultural stuff in there that I think is different. I love food, so there's quite a lot about food. I love cars from the 60s, so our hero has a 60s Maserati. For me, I think it's different. The last thing I would say is it's quite unusual to have two lead characters who are equal and bring out the best in each other. You know, most thrillers, you know, you have a Holmes and Watson or any bunch of thrillers, there's usually a lead brain and somebody else for them to play off.
Yeah.
And this isn't the case, although, as I said, it's not the same time of movie, but that was the case in Lethal Weapon. I knew I'd remember it, Glover and Gibson played off each other, although much more action than this. And that intrigues me. I don't like always having a smart ass.
Absolutely. And finally, to wrap up today, what is your tip to anybody sitting there thinking, I want to write a book? I know you've said stick with it, but what's your other one?
Well, I think I've said it. Write what you know.
Yeah.
And give yourself time. And I think the most surprising thing I learnt is it'll take you twice as long to edit as it will to write.
Yeah.
And secondly, you have to understand digital media, and you have to work with people who really understand digital media, somebody like yourself. And finally, you have to be, you know, you have to find a publisher. I mean, you know, they don't come to you. You've got to go out, you've got to bang on a lot of doors.
Yeah.
Rejection is just par for the course.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Well, so anybody who's doing it, I wish you the best of luck. And I expect to see a whole flurry of more Maltese authors, although there are quite a lot here anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Quite a prolific little island.
It
we
is.
have here.
It's an amazing island. Has a very high density of artistic people.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today
Well,
on the
thank you
stage,
very
for being
much.
with us here at the book festival.
Thank you.
Lovely to, again, talk to so many people about this wonderful book. I highly recommend it myself, so if you are looking for a great thriller, go out, get Fallout, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.